A lost voice finds its moment. The courtroom was a maze of echoes and whispers, each sound bouncing off its high walls and ornate wooden beams. Sunlight filtered through the tall, arched windows, casting an almost ethereal glow on the polished oak furniture. Despite the beauty of the room, it felt cold and uninviting to Daniel, a boy who had come here carrying the weight of grief, loss, and uncertainty. Daniel sat quietly on a bench, his small frame hunched, his shoulders curled inward as if trying to make himself invisible. His navy blue sweater, worn at the cuffs, itched against his skin. It had been his best piece of clothing, one his mother always ironed carefully for Sunday school. But now she was gone, and the sweater only reminded him of the emptiness that followed. His feet dangled a few inches above the courtroom floor, a child in a world of adults, each of whom seemed too consumed by their own roles to notice him. To the lawyers, he was just another piece of evidence, a human consequence of tragedy to add weight to their arguments. To the reporters gathered in the back row, scribbling furiously into their notepads, he was a compelling side story in a trial about justice, guilt, and consequences. To the man seated at the defense table, Daniel was something else entirely, a painful reminder of a night he couldn't take back. The boy's gaze fell to the scuffed tips of his shoes, the only part of him that felt grounded. They were worn but sturdy, a gift from his father after a particularly good week at work. "Sturdy shoes take you far, kiddo," his father had said, ruffling Daniel's hair. Now those shoes were all he had left of a life that felt like a distant memory. Across the room, the defense lawyer whispered into the ear of Michael Sullivan, the man responsible for the crash that had stolen Daniel's parents. Sullivan's slumped posture and vacant stare did little to evoke sympathy, at least not from Daniel. His hands clenched the edges of the bench as he fought the rising tide of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Anger, sadness, fear, they all swirled inside, but he kept them tightly bottled, knowing that breaking down would only make him feel smaller. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Harding, stood from her chair and approached the judge's bench. Her voice cut through the quiet hum of the room like a blade. "Your Honor, the evidence we have provided today shows without a doubt that Mr. Sullivan's actions were not only reckless but deliberate in their disregard for others' safety. Blood alcohol tests confirm his intoxication was well above the legal limit, and witnesses have testified to his erratic behavior before the crash." Judge Alan Cooper nodded solemnly. His silver hair and lined face gave him an air of wisdom, though his eyes revealed a softness that often took defendants and lawyers by surprise. He looked toward Daniel, his gaze steady but kind. The boy's hands were trembling slightly, and the judge gestured discreetly to a court officer, who brought Daniel a small glass of water. Daniel nodded in gratitude, though he barely sipped from the cup. As Ms. Harding continued, Daniel found himself caught in the tide of her words. Each detail brought fresh images to his mind. His father's smile as they drove back from the movie that night, his mother's laugh as she teased him about falling asleep during the action scenes. Then came the headlights, the screeching tires, the deafening crash, and the silence that followed. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, but the images wouldn't leave. His breathing grew uneven, and the judge noticed again, signaling for a short recess. The room emptied gradually, lawyers shuffling papers and spectators whispering among themselves. Daniel remained seated, his hands now gripping the hem of his sweater. Judge Cooper stepped down from the bench and walked over to him, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. He crouched to meet Daniel's eye level, his expression gentle but firm. "Daniel," the judge said softly, "are you all right?" The boy nodded hesitantly, though his tear-streaked face told another story. Judge Cooper placed a hand on the bench next to Daniel, giving the boy space but letting him know he wasn't alone. "You've been very brave today," the judge continued. "I know this isn't easy." "I just want it to stop," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. "I want it all to stop." Judge Cooper nodded slowly, his heart aching for the boy. As a man who had seen countless cases pass through his courtroom, he knew the law's limitations. Justice could punish the guilty, but it couldn't mend the broken hearts left in the wake of their actions. "You're stronger than you think," the judge said, his voice steady. "And I promise you, Daniel, this court will do everything in its power to make sure you're safe." Daniel blinked at him, a glimmer of trust flickering in his tear-filled eyes. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he clung to the judge's words like a lifeline. The court session resumed after the recess. More witnesses came forward, painting a damning picture of Sullivan's actions that night. Each testimony felt like another brick added to the wall of grief and anger surrounding Daniel's heart. When the toxicologist explained the effects of Sullivan's blood alcohol level, the boy flinched as if the words themselves were physical blows. Finally, Judge Cooper called for closing arguments. As the lawyers spoke, Daniel's mind drifted. He thought about his parents, what they would want for him, what they would say if they could see him now. He imagined his mother's warm hug, his father's reassuring words. The ache in his chest grew heavier, and he felt more alone than ever. When the verdict was delivered, guilty on all counts, a quiet gasp rippled through the room. Daniel didn't react outwardly, but inside, a storm raged. Justice had been served, but it didn't feel like enough. His parents were still gone, and he was still alone. As the courtroom emptied once more, Daniel remained seated, his small frame lost in the vastness of the room. Judge Cooper watched him from the bench, his heart heavy. He saw a boy carrying the weight of a world that had been cruel to him, and he knew he couldn't let it end here. The judge removed his robe and stepped down, walking over to the boy. He sat beside him, his presence steady and calm. "What happens to me now?" Daniel asked, his voice barely audible. Judge Cooper hesitated. The boy had no family left, no home to return to. The foster care system would likely take him in, but it wasn't the answer the judge wanted to give. "You'll be taken care of," the judge said carefully. "But if you need anything, anything at all, you can always come to me." Daniel looked up at him, his eyes searching the judge's face. For the first time in weeks, a tiny spark of hope flickered within him. Can I come home with you?" he asked, his voice trembling but filled with quiet determination. The judge froze, taken aback by the boy's raw honesty. The weight of the request settled over him, but so did the realization of what it meant. This boy wasn't just asking for shelter, he was asking for a chance to feel safe, to be loved, to belong. Judge Cooper nodded slowly, tears brimming in his eyes. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll figure it out together." A fragile hope. The courtroom had been silent for several minutes, but Daniel's plea still echoed in Judge Cooper's mind. "Can I come home with you?" The boy's words had pierced through the carefully constructed boundaries the judge had built over years of upholding the law. It wasn't often that a case left him feeling helpless outside the confines of his profession. But Daniel wasn't just a case, he was a child who had lost everything. Judge Cooper had paused, unsure how to answer. What the boy was asking was far from the realm of legal proceedings. It was deeply personal, raw, and real. Yet, as he looked into Daniel's tearful eyes, he knew that brushing off the question with polite reassurances would be an unforgivable betrayal of the trust the boy had just shown him. The courtroom was nearly empty now, the murmurs of the departing crowd fading into the hallways outside. Judge Cooper leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he chose his words carefully. "Daniel," he began, his voice steady but soft, "what you're asking is, it's not something I can promise you right here, right now. But I do promise you this. I'm not going to let you face this alone." Daniel's small hands fidgeted with the hem of his sweater, twisting it nervously as he tried to decipher what the judge's words meant. He nodded faintly, his lips pressed into a thin line to keep from trembling. The judge rose from the bench and turned to his court officer. "Please arrange for Child Protective Services to meet with us in my chambers," he instructed quietly. Then he looked back at Daniel. "Come with me, son." The word son wasn't intentional. It simply slipped out, but Daniel clung to it like a lifeline. He followed Judge Cooper through a side door into a smaller, warmer room lined with bookshelves and leather-bound legal volumes. The air here felt less oppressive, and the sunlight streaming through the windows softened the atmosphere. The judge gestured for Daniel to sit in one of the plush chairs by a mahogany desk, and the boy hesitantly obliged. A staff member brought in a tray with hot chocolate and a plate of cookies. "I thought you might need this," Judge Cooper said with a small smile. Daniel nodded, mumbling a soft thank you as he took a sip of the warm drink. For the first time in what felt like forever, the tight knot in his chest loosened just slightly. A knock on the door interrupted the fragile quiet. A woman in a neat gray suit entered, her name tag identifying her as Marilyn Carter, CPS representative. She was polite but firm, her practiced smile aimed at Daniel before turning her attention to Judge Cooper. "Your Honor," she began, "we've reviewed Daniel's case extensively. Currently, the recommendation is placement in a temporary foster home while the long-term solution is arranged. There are several options we can explore." Daniel's heart sank. He'd heard those words before. Temporary placement. It always sounded clinical, distant, like being handed off to strangers who might or might not care. "Ms. Carter," Judge Cooper interrupted, his voice measured, "Daniel has just been through one of the most traumatic experiences a child can endure. Shuffling him through a system that may not meet his needs isn't a solution. It's a bandage. What he needs is stability." Marilyn raised an eyebrow, her clipboard resting against her side. "Your Honor, I understand your concern, but the process is designed to ensure the child's safety." "I'd like to explore another option," the judge interjected, his tone firmer now. He turned toward Daniel, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes. "Daniel, if CPS agrees, and if you're comfortable with it, I'd like to offer you a place in my home. For as long as you need it." Daniel froze, the cookie in his hand crumbling under the pressure of his grip. You mean it?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The judge nodded, his eyes softening. "Yes, Daniel, I mean it." The CPS representative looked skeptical but intrigued. "Your Honor," she said, flipping through her notes, "this isn't unheard of, but it's highly irregular. You would need to undergo the same approval process as any foster parent, including background checks, home inspections, and psychological evaluations." "I'll do whatever is required," Judge Cooper replied without hesitation. "But Daniel needs somewhere to go now, not weeks from now. Can we arrange for an emergency placement in my care while the paperwork is processed?" Marilyn hesitated, glancing at Daniel. His wide, pleading eyes seemed to tilt the balance in her internal debate. "I'll need to consult with my supervisor," she said finally. "But if we get preliminary approval, you may be able to take him home tonight under temporary guardianship." "Thank you," Judge Cooper said sincerely. Hours later, after more discussions, signatures, and phone calls than Daniel could keep track of, he found himself sitting in the passenger seat of Judge Cooper's car. His backpack, stuffed with the few belongings he'd been able to salvage from his old life, rested on his lap. He clutched it tightly, as if it were a shield against the unknown. The drive was quiet but not uncomfortable. The judge glanced at Daniel occasionally, offering him reassuring smiles. "You okay, buddy?" he asked after a while. Daniel nodded, though his stomach churned with nerves. He had no idea what to expect. Would the judge have a family? Would they like him? Would he be in the way? The car pulled into the driveway of a modest but welcoming house. The porch light cast a warm glow, and flower pots lined the front steps. As they approached the door, it opened to reveal a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair. "Welcome home," she said, her voice gentle. "You must be Daniel." Daniel looked up at her, his throat tight with emotion. "Hi," he managed. "This is my wife, Ellen," Judge Cooper explained. "She's been looking forward to meeting you." Ellen knelt to Daniel's level, her smile radiating warmth. "We've got a room ready for you, sweetheart. Let me show you." Daniel followed her upstairs, his heart pounding. The room was small but cozy, painted in soft green tones with a bed, a desk, and a bookshelf half filled with books. A few posters of animals and outer space decorated the walls, and the bedding was crisp and clean. "We didn't know what you'd like," Ellen said, "but we can change anything to make it feel more like home." Daniel shook his head quickly. "It's perfect," he said, his voice barely audible. He set his backpack down and pulled out a photo of his parents, one of the few things he'd managed to keep. He placed it carefully on the desk, his hands trembling slightly. Ellen noticed and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "They'll always be with you," she said softly. "And we're here too. Whatever you need, Daniel." For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a flicker of something he thought he'd lost forever: hope. He turned to Ellen and nodded, a small tentative smile forming on his lips. That night, as he lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring up at the ceiling, Daniel felt the weight of the past begin to ease, if only slightly. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so alone. Settling into the unknown. The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains of Daniel's new room, casting warm patches of light on the soft green walls. For a moment, Daniel didn't open his eyes. He lay still, cocooned in the warmth of the blankets, hoping to stretch the dreamlike comfort of the moment just a little longer. But the quiet hum of distant voices downstairs brought him back to reality. He sat up slowly, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar room. His parents' photo on the desk was the only thing that tied him to the life he'd known before everything had shattered. Taking a deep breath, he reached for the picture frame, his fingers tracing the edges. "Good morning, Mom." "Good morning, Dad," he whispered. The smell of bacon wafted through the air, pulling him from his thoughts. His stomach grumbled audibly, and for the first time in weeks, he realized he was hungry. Throwing off the blankets, he slid out of bed, his feet sinking into the soft rug Ellen had placed beside the bed. The kitchen was bustling with quiet activity. Ellen stood by the stove, flipping pancakes onto a platter, while Judge Cooper, now just Alan in this home setting, sat at the kitchen island reading the morning paper. The clinking of dishes and the sizzling of bacon created a comforting soundtrack. When Daniel hesitated in the doorway, Ellen turned, her face lighting up in a warm smile. "Good morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep okay?" Daniel nodded shyly, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his sweater. "Well, you've got perfect timing," she said, gesturing to the table. "Breakfast is just about ready. Go ahead and sit down." Alan folded his paper and set it aside, smiling at Daniel. "Morning, buddy. Hope you're ready for some of Ellen's famous pancakes. They've been known to turn bad mornings into good ones." Daniel slid into a chair, unsure how to respond. It had been so long since he'd sat at a table with anyone for breakfast, let alone in a home that wasn't his own. The sight of the neatly set table, complete with a pitcher of orange juice and a small vase of flowers, made him feel both comforted and out of place. Ellen set a plate in front of him, piled high with pancakes, bacon, and scrambled eggs. "If you don't like something, just let me know." "Okay," she said gently. Daniel stared at the food, his throat tightening. The last breakfast he'd had like this was with his parents. His mother had always made him pancakes shaped like stars, and his dad would sneak extra bacon onto his plate when she wasn't looking. He blinked rapidly, willing the tears to stay away. "You don't have to eat it all," Alan said, his voice soft. "Just take your time." Daniel picked up his fork and took a small bite of the pancake. The taste of butter and syrup was almost overwhelming, not because it was too sweet, but because it tasted like home. He chewed slowly, his eyes focused on his plate. After breakfast, Ellen suggested a walk around the neighborhood. "It'll be good to stretch your legs," she said, "and you can get a feel for the area." Daniel hesitated but eventually agreed. He followed her and Alan out the front door, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. The air was crisp, and the autumn leaves crunched under their feet as they strolled down the quiet street. Ellen pointed out different houses as they walked. "That's the baker's house. They have a big golden retriever named Max. And over there, the Johnsons have a little vegetable garden they tend to all year." Daniel nodded politely but didn't say much. He couldn't help but feel like an outsider, like he was walking through someone else's world. Alan seemed to sense Daniel's unease. He slowed his pace to match the boys and said, "I know this is a lot to take in. New place, new faces. But you don't have to figure it all out right away. Just take it one step at a time." Daniel looked up at him, surprised by the calm understanding in the judge's voice. "What if I mess up?" he asked quietly. Alan smiled, his expression warm. "You're not here to be perfect, Daniel. You're here to be yourself. That's all we want." The rest of the day passed in a blur of small moments. Ellen showed Daniel how to use the microwave to reheat leftovers, just in case he ever got hungry and didn't want to ask. Ellen helped him set up a small shelf for his books, and even brought in a globe he'd found in the attic. "Figured you might like it," he said. "Maybe we can mark all the places you want to visit someday." That night, after dinner, Daniel sat at the desk in his room, staring at the globe. His fingers traced the outlines of countries and oceans, his mind wandering. He thought of his parents, and how they'd always talked about taking a family trip to see the Grand Canyon. He wondered if he'd ever get to go now. The next morning, Ellen walked him to his new school. The towering brick building loomed over him, its windows gleaming in the early sunlight. Daniel's heart raced as they approached the front doors. He hadn't been to school since the accident, and the thought of walking into a room full of strangers made his stomach twist. Ellen crouched down to meet his gaze. "You've got this, Daniel," she said, her voice steady. "Just take it one moment at a time. And if you need anything, anything at all, you tell your teacher, okay?" He nodded, gripping the straps of his backpack tightly. Inside, the principal greeted them warmly and led Daniel to his classroom. The teacher, Mrs. Richards, was a kind-looking woman with a gentle smile. She introduced Daniel to the class and showed him to an empty seat near the window. The day passed slowly. The other kids were polite but distant, and Daniel kept to himself. At lunch, he sat at the far end of a table, picking at his sandwich. He felt like an invisible barrier separated him from the rest of the students. He wasn't ready to talk about his past, and he wasn't sure he wanted to make friends who might ask questions he couldn't answer. When the final bell rang, Daniel was relieved to see Ellen waiting for him outside. She greeted him with a smile and a warm hug. "How was it?" she asked. "It was okay," Daniel replied softly. Ellen didn't push for more details, sensing that he needed time to process. They walked home in companionable silence, the sound of their footsteps blending with the rustle of leaves in the wind. That evening, Alan suggested they watch a movie together. "Your pick," he said, holding up a stack of DVDs. "We've got adventure, comedy, even some classics." Daniel hesitated but finally pointed to a movie about a boy who trains a dragon. It had been one of his favorites when he was younger. As they sat on the couch, Daniel found himself relaxing for the first time in days. He even laughed at a few of the jokes, surprising himself. By the time the credits rolled, he felt a little lighter. Ellen handed him a blanket, and Alan ruffled his hair playfully. "You've got good taste in movies, kiddo," the judge said with a grin. Later, as Daniel lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he realized something unexpected. For the first time since the accident, he didn't feel entirely alone. It wasn't home. At least not yet. But it was something. And for now, that was enough. A fragile bond. Daniel's days began to settle into a rhythm. The morning started with Ellen gently knocking on his door, her sing-song voice carrying through the hallway as she announced breakfast. Alan would already be at the table, sipping coffee and reading the news, but always ready with a warm smile and a few words of encouragement for Daniel before school. But as the weeks passed, the quiet routine did little to ease the storm inside him. Though he appreciated Ellen's kindness and Alan's calm reassurances, There were moments when the loss of his parents hit him with the force of a tidal wave. At school, he often drifted through lessons, his thoughts far away. The other kids tried to include him, but their efforts felt forced, their laughter and chatter too carefree for him to relate to. One afternoon, as Daniel trudged home with Ellen, his backpack hanging limply from one shoulder, she sensed the weight in his silence. "Rough day?" she asked gently. Daniel shrugged, his eyes fixed on the sidewalk. "Just tired," he muttered. Ellen didn't press, but as they walked, she reached out and gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "sometimes when things feel too big to handle, it helps to talk about them. Maybe not right away, but when you're ready." Daniel nodded, though he didn't respond. Talking felt impossible. How could he explain the ache that never seemed to go away? The way he felt like he was stuck in a world that kept spinning while his had come to a grinding halt. That evening, as Daniel sat at the desk in his room, he found himself staring at the photo of his parents. His father's arm was draped protectively around his mother's shoulders, their smiles as bright as the sun behind them. He remembered that day vividly, the last beach trip they'd taken before the accident. His dad had spent hours teaching him how to build sandcastles, while his mom kept trying to snap photos of him mid-laugh. The memory brought a lump to his throat. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as a wave of anger surged through him. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. Why had Sullivan decided to drink that night? Why had his parents been in the wrong place at the wrong time? Why did he have to carry the burden of their absence, while the man responsible still got to breathe? A knock on the door startled him out of his thoughts. "Hey, buddy," Alan said, poking his head in. "Everything okay?" Daniel quickly wiped at his eyes and nodded. "Yeah, I'm fine." Alan stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He pulled up a chair beside Daniel, his expression thoughtful. "I know this hasn't been easy," he said gently. "Losing your parents, starting over in a new place, it's a lot for anyone to handle. But I want you to know, it's okay to feel angry. It's okay to feel sad. You don't have to hide it." Daniel looked down at his hands, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I don't know how to stop feeling this way?" Alan rested a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You don't have to figure it out all at once. It's like standing at the bottom of a mountain. You take it one step at a time. And you don't have to climb it alone." The next day, Alan came home early with a surprise. "I thought we could use a little fresh air," he announced, holding up a pair of hiking boots. Daniel frowned, skeptical. "Hiking? Not the intense kind." Alan assured him with a grin. "There's a trail nearby with a great view at the top. I used to take my kids there when they were younger. What do you say?" Ellen chimed in, her hands full of packed sandwiches. "It'll be fun, Daniel. And there's no rush. We'll go at your pace." Reluctantly, Daniel agreed. A part of him wanted to protest, to hide away in his room where he didn't have to pretend to be okay. But another part, the part that remembered how much his parents had loved nature, pushed him to give it a try. The trail wound through a dense forest, the air crisp and cool. Alan led the way, pointing out different types of trees and stopping occasionally to admire the vibrant reds and yellows of the autumn leaves. Ellen walked beside Daniel, matching his slower pace and sharing stories about her own childhood hikes. At first, Daniel stayed quiet, focusing on the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. But as they climbed higher, the fresh air and peaceful surroundings began to chip away at his guarded exterior. He found himself listening intently as Alan described a time his daughter had tried to climb a tree and ended up stuck halfway. By the time they reached the summit, Daniel's chest was heaving from the effort, but a sense of accomplishment glimmered beneath his exhaustion. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills blanketed in fiery autumn colors stretched as far as the eye could see. A soft breeze carried the scent of pine and earth, and for a moment, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: calm. Alan spread out a blanket, and Ellen handed out sandwiches. As they ate, They sat in companionable silence, the beauty of the landscape speaking louder than words. "You know," Alan said after a while, "when my wife and I first moved here, this was our favorite spot. We'd come up here to clear our heads, figure things out." Ellen nodded. "There's something about being up here that makes everything else feel smaller." Daniel stared out at the horizon, their words sinking in. Maybe they were right. Maybe the things weighing him down didn't have to feel so big, at least not all the time. As they made their way back down the trail, Daniel found himself walking a little closer to Ellen. He still didn't have the words to express everything he was feeling, but he didn't feel as heavy anymore. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could start to heal. That night, as Daniel lay in bed, he glanced at the globe on his desk. He reached over, spinning it slowly. His finger hovered over the map, finally landing on a spot his dad used to talk about, Yellowstone National Park. A small smile tugged at his lips. Maybe one day he'd go there. Maybe one day he'd feel brave enough to dream again. Facing the shadows, Daniel's life began to take on a rhythm. But it was a fragile one, like walking a tightrope above the abyss of his grief. School was still a challenge. The whispers and occasional stares from classmates felt like tiny knives pricking at his skin. Yet the steady presence of Alan and Ellen gave him a sense of stability he hadn't felt in weeks. But some shadows refused to stay buried. The nightmares that had plagued Daniel since the accident persisted, dark and vivid. They always began the same way, his parents' laughter filling the car as they drove home from the movie theater. Then came the headlights, the screeching tires, the deafening crash. In his dreams, he could never reach them in time. He would wake up gasping, his body drenched in sweat, the echoes of their voices fading into the stillness of his room. One particularly cold night, Daniel woke from yet another nightmare, his heart pounding like a drum. He sat up, hugging his knees to his chest, trying to steady his breathing. The house was silent, the kind of silence that felt alive, pressing in from all sides. He reached for the photo of his parents on the desk, holding it tightly, as if it could anchor him. A soft knock at the door startled him. "Daniel." Ellen's voice was gentle, almost hesitant. "I heard you. Can I come in?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded, realizing too late that Alan couldn't see him in the dark. "Yeah," he whispered. Alan stepped inside, his robe wrapped tightly around him. He carried a mug of warm milk, which he placed on the nightstand before sitting on the edge of the bed. "Bad dream?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with understanding. Daniel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Alan waited, giving Daniel the space to gather his thoughts. When the boy finally looked up, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears, Alan said, "It's okay to talk about it. Sometimes saying it out loud can make it a little less scary." "They always die," Daniel blurted, his voice cracking. "Every time I close my eyes, I see them, and I can't do anything to stop it. I keep hearing the crash, and then it's just nothing." Alan's heart ached at the raw pain in Daniel's words. He shifted closer, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. "I wish I could take those dreams away," he said softly. "I wish I could make it so you never had to feel this way. But I promise you, those dreams don't mean you're failing them. They don't mean you didn't do enough." Daniel's voice was small, almost inaudible. "It feels like I let them down." Alan shook his head firmly. "No, Daniel. What happened wasn't your fault. It wasn't something you could control. Your parents loved you more than anything in the world, and I know they wouldn't want you to carry this weight." For a long moment, Daniel didn't respond. Then, slowly, he whispered, "How do you know?" Alan hesitated, then said, "Because I'm a parent, too. And no matter what happens, our love for our children doesn't stop. Not in life, and not after. It's the one thing that never goes away." Daniel's grip on the photo loosened slightly, and for the first time, he felt the tiniest flicker of relief. Alan sat with him until his breathing evened out, and sleep finally took him again. The next morning, Ellen suggested they do something to take Daniel's mind off things. "There's an art fair in town," she said over breakfast. "Lots of booths, live music, and good food. What do you think?" Daniel shrugged, not wanting to seem ungrateful, but unsure if he had the energy for it. "It'll be fun," Alan chimed in. "Besides, I hear they have an amazing pie stand." Reluctantly, Daniel agreed. They drove into town, the streets bustling with people as the fair came to life. Colorful banners hung between lampposts, and the scent of cinnamon and roasted nuts filled the air. As they wandered through the stalls, Daniel found himself drawn to a booth displaying handmade wooden carvings. The craftsman, an older man with a kind smile, was working on a small figure of a bird. "You like carving?" the man asked, noticing Daniel's interest. Daniel shrugged. "I don't know. I've never tried." "Well," the man said, handing him a small block of wood and a blunt carving tool, "no time like the present. Go on, give it a shot." Daniel hesitated but took the tool, his fingers wrapping around it awkwardly. The man guided him through the first few cuts, and soon Daniel was lost in the simple, repetitive motion. For the first time in weeks, his mind quieted. When he finished, the block of wood vaguely resembled a small fish, but the sense of accomplishment made his chest swell. "That's a fine first piece," the craftsman said with an approving nod. "You've got a good eye for detail." Ellen and Alan watched from a distance, smiling as they saw the faintest hint of pride on Daniel's face. "He's starting to come out of his shell," Ellen whispered. The afternoon passed quickly, and by the time they returned home, Daniel felt lighter. He placed his wooden fish on the desk beside his parents' photo, a small symbol of progress. That night, as he lay in bed, he didn't dread sleep as much. The nightmares might come, but now he had something to hold on to, a tiny reminder that not every moment had to be dark. But healing wasn't a straight line. A few days later, Daniel had a hard day at school. A group of boys had teased him for sitting alone at lunch, their whispers carrying just loud enough for him to hear. "Orphan boy," one of them had sneered. The words cut deep, reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. When Daniel got home, he threw his backpack onto the floor and retreated to his room without a word. Ellen found him sitting by the window, staring out at the backyard. "Rough day?" she asked, her voice soft. Daniel nodded but didn't elaborate. Ellen sat beside him, silent for a moment. "You know," she said, "sometimes people say mean things because they don't understand. It doesn't make it right, but it doesn't mean you have to carry their words with you." Daniel looked at her, his expression wary. "What if it doesn't stop?" Ellen's heart ached for him. "Then you keep going anyway," she said gently. "You're stronger than you think, Daniel, and you don't have to face this alone." That evening, Alan surprised Daniel with a new carving kit. "I noticed how much you enjoyed it at the fair," he said, setting the box on Daniel's desk. "I thought maybe it could be something to help when you're feeling overwhelmed." Daniel's eyes lit up for the first time all day. "Really? This is for me?" "All yours," Alan said with a smile. "Just don't carve the furniture. Ellen might not forgive me." For the first time that day, Daniel laughed. A small, genuine laugh that made Alan's chest tighten with hope. It wasn't much, but it was a step. And as Alan watched Daniel carefully unpack the tools, his focus entirely on the task at hand, he realized just how far they'd both come. The shadows still lingered, but they weren't as heavy as they had been. One step at a time, Daniel was learning how to live again, breaking the silence. The days turned colder, the crisp autumn air giving way to the biting chill of early winter. Daniel's world continued to shift in subtle ways. The Coopers had settled into a quiet rhythm of life with him, respecting his silences and celebrating his small victories without overwhelming him. Yet despite their unwavering kindness, Daniel still felt as though he were standing on the edge of a fragile new existence, unsure when it might shatter. At school, he remained mostly to himself, though he had begun to notice the kindness of a girl named Emily who often sat near him in class. She was quiet, like him, but in a way that felt intentional rather than uncertain. One day, she slid a folded paper across his desk during math class. It was a crude doodle of a dog with floppy ears, its tongue sticking out in an exaggerated way. Daniel blinked at the drawing, surprised, and looked at her. Emily smiled shyly, her cheeks pink, then turned back to her notebook as though nothing had happened. For the first time, Daniel felt something stir within him that he hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity. That evening, as he sat at the kitchen table carving a small bird from a block of wood, Alan walked in and set down a steaming cup of hot chocolate. "You've got quite the talent there," Alan said, admiring the intricate feather details Daniel was carving into the bird's wings. Daniel shrugged but didn't look up. "It's not that good." Alan pulled up a chair across from him, his expression serious but kind. "You know, talent isn't about perfection. It's about sticking with something even when it feels hard. And you're doing great." Daniel didn't respond, but his carving strokes became more deliberate, his focus sharpening. Alan let the silence stretch, knowing that sometimes it was better to leave space for Daniel to speak if he wanted to. Finally, Daniel set down the carving tool and asked, "Were you ever scared?" Alan tilted his head, caught off guard by the question. "Scared of what, buddy?" Of not being enough. Of messing up." Alan's expression softened. "All the time," he admitted. "When I first became a judge, I was terrified I'd make the wrong decisions, that I'd fail the people who trusted me to do the right thing. But you know what I learned?" Daniel shook his head, his eyes wide and curious. "I learned that being scared doesn't mean you can't do something. It just means you care enough to want to do it right." Alan leaned forward, his voice steady. "You're not alone in feeling that way, Daniel, and you don't have to be perfect to be enough." The next day, Alan surprised Daniel by taking him to the community center after school. "There's someone I want you to meet," he said as they walked through the center's glass doors. Inside, the warm buzz of conversation filled the air. They walked past rooms where people painted, played instruments, and even practiced yoga. Finally, they reached a room where a group of kids sat around a table, their hands busy shaping clay into various forms. A woman with curly hair and paint-streaked overalls greeted them warmly. "Alan, and this must be Daniel." She extended her hand. "I'm Sophie. I run the art therapy program here." Daniel hesitated before shaking her hand, glancing at Alan for reassurance. "Sophie works with kids who've been through tough times," Alan explained. "I thought you might like to try it out." Daniel looked at the table where the other kids were laughing and chatting as they worked. He felt a familiar pang of anxiety, but also a flicker of curiosity. Sophie smiled. "No pressure, Daniel. You can just watch today if you want, or you can sit down and give it a try. It's up to you." Daniel decided to stay. At first, he sat at the edge of the group, watching as the other kids molded the clay into shapes. One boy made a lopsided castle, while a girl next to him sculpted what looked like a dragon. Slowly, Daniel reached for a piece of clay, its cool, pliable texture unfamiliar under his fingers. "What are you going to make?" Sophie asked gently, kneeling beside him. Daniel shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe a tree." "That's a great idea," Sophie said, her voice encouraging. "Trees are strong. They bend with the wind, but they don't break." As Daniel worked, he found himself lost in the rhythm of shaping the clay. His hands moved with a confidence he hadn't realized he had, and for the first time, he felt a sense of control over something, however small. When they got home that evening, Daniel showed Ellen the small clay tree he had made. She gasped with delight, her hands clasping her chest. "Daniel, this is wonderful. Look at the detail in the branches. You have such a gift." Daniel flushed with pride, his earlier doubts momentarily forgotten. "It's just a tree," he said, but there was a hint of a smile on his face. "It's not just anything," Ellen said firmly. It's yours, and it's beautiful. But life had a way of reminding Daniel that healing wasn't linear. A week later, during his regular walk home from school, he felt the familiar prickle of unease at the back of his neck. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a man in a dark jacket lingering by a lamppost. Daniel's heart raced. He quickened his pace, his mind flashing back to the trial, to the hateful glares of Michael Sullivan's family in the courtroom. He didn't stop until he reached the Cooper's house, slamming the door behind him. "What's wrong?" Ellen asked, rushing in from his study. Daniel's breathing was erratic, his hands shaking. Someone was following me," he managed to say. Ellen's expression turned serious. He placed a steadying hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You're safe now," he said firmly. "Let's talk about what happened." That evening, Allen made several phone calls, ensuring that the local police would patrol the neighborhood more frequently. He also reached out to a friend who specialized in security, arranging for cameras to be installed around the house. As the days passed, Daniel remained on edge, his anxiety creeping back into his daily life. But he also noticed something else: Allen and Ellen's unwavering presence. They didn't brush off his fears or tell him to get over it. Instead, they listened, reassured, and took action to make him feel safe. One night, as they sat by the fireplace, Daniel spoke up. "Why do you care so much about me? I'm not your kid." Ellen set down the book he'd been reading, his gaze steady and kind. "You're right, Daniel. You're not my child by birth. But that doesn't mean we don't care about you like you're part of our family." Ellen nodded, her smile warm. "Family isn't just about who you're born to, sweetheart. It's about who's there for you, who loves you, and who wants to see you happy. And we want all of that for you." For the first time, Daniel let himself believe it. The walls he had built around his heart began to crack, just a little. And in that moment, as the fire crackled softly and the Cooper's words wrapped around him like a blanket, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: a glimmer of belonging. Rebuilding and redemption. Winter tightened its grip on the town, coating rooftops and trees in shimmering frost. Daniel's world, while still fragile, began to feel sturdier. The Coopers had carved a space for him in their home and hearts, but more importantly, they'd helped him carve a space for himself. Yet, even as he slowly embraced this newfound stability, the shadows of his past lingered, waiting to test his strength. One morning, as Daniel walked into the kitchen, he found Allen sitting at the table, reading a letter. His brows were furrowed, and his lips pressed into a thin line. Ellen stood by the stove, her hands stilling mid-motion, as she watched her husband's reaction. "What's wrong?" Daniel asked, his voice hesitant. Allen looked up, forcing a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's nothing to worry about, buddy," he said, but Daniel caught the tension in his voice. "It's about the trial, isn't it?" Daniel guessed. He could tell by the way Allen's hand tightened around the paper. Allen sighed and set the letter down. "It's from the prison," he admitted. "Michael Sullivan has requested to speak with you. He says he wants to apologize." The room seemed to shrink, the words hanging heavy in the air. Daniel felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. He wants to see me?" he asked, his voice trembling. Ellen nodded. "But you don't have to go. It's entirely your choice. No one can force you to do this." Ellen crossed the room, kneeling beside Daniel and placing a comforting hand on his arm. "Sweetheart, this isn't something you have to decide right now. Take your time." Daniel's mind raced. He hadn't thought about Michael Sullivan since the sentencing, and now, the idea of facing the man who had taken his parents from him stirred a whirlwind of emotions: anger, fear, and an odd, unwelcome curiosity. That night, as Daniel lay in bed, he stared at the ceiling, the shadows from the street lamp outside dancing across the room. His parents' faces flashed in his mind, their laughter echoing faintly in his ears. He thought about all the nights he'd spent wishing for answers, for closure, for something to make the pain less suffocating. The next morning, He walked into Alan's study. "I want to go," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Alan looked up from his desk, his expression a mix of surprise and concern. "Are you sure?" Daniel nodded. "I need to hear what he has to say." The prison was colder than Daniel expected. The sterile walls and harsh fluorescent lights making the air feel thin and unwelcoming. Alan walked beside him, his presence a steadying force as they approached the visitor room. Ellen had wanted to come, but Daniel had asked her to stay home. He didn't know why, but something about this felt like a step he needed to take on his own, with Alan who had become his anchor. They entered a small room with a single table and 2 chairs. On the other side of the glass partition, Michael Sullivan sat in an orange jumpsuit, his once proud posture now slumped. His hands were cuffed, and his face bore lines that hadn't been there during the trial. He looked up as Daniel entered, his eyes widening slightly with recognition. Daniel hesitated, then sat down across from him. Alan stayed by the door, his presence reassuring but unobtrusive. For a long moment, neither Daniel nor Sullivan spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with the weight of everything unsaid. Finally, Sullivan cleared his throat. I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, his voice hoarse. Daniel's fingers curled around the edge of the table. "Why did you want to see me?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Sullivan flinched but nodded, as though he'd expected the hostility. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I wanted to tell you. I never meant for any of this to happen." Daniel's chest tightened. "You didn't mean it," he echoed, his voice rising. "You got drunk. You got in a car. You killed them. You didn't mean it." Tears filled Sullivan's eyes, but Daniel didn't care. For so long, he'd bottled up his anger, his sadness, his confusion. Now it poured out of him in a torrent of words. "You took everything from me," he continued, his voice cracking. "You didn't even care. You didn't think. And now I have to live with it every day while you. I do care," Sullivan interrupted, his voice raw. "I know that doesn't change anything. I know it doesn't bring them back. But I think about what I did every single day. I wake up in this cell, and I see their faces. I see you in that courtroom. And I hate myself for it." Daniel's fists clenched. "Good," he spat, his voice trembling. "You should." Another silence fell between them, the weight of Sullivan's words settling over Daniel like a heavy blanket. The anger that had surged through him moments ago began to ebb, replaced by something quieter, something heavier. "I don't forgive you," Daniel said finally, his voice firm, but not as sharp. "I don't know if I ever will. But I needed to hear you say it." Sullivan nodded, his expression filled with a sorrow so deep it almost startled Daniel. "I understand," he said softly, "and I'll never stop being sorry." The ride home was quiet. Alan didn't press Daniel to talk, instead giving him the space to process. When they reached the house, Daniel went straight to his room, his mind a storm of emotions. He sat at his desk, staring at the wooden bird he'd carved weeks ago. His hands moved almost instinctively, reaching for the carving tools Alan had given him. He pulled out a fresh block of wood and began to shape it, each cut of the blade releasing some of the tension coiled inside him. By the time Ellen knocked softly on his door to check on him, he carved the beginnings of a small, simple heart. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. But it felt like a start. The next day, Daniel brought the wooden heart downstairs and handed it to Alan. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being there." Alan looked at the carving, his eyes shining. "You're welcome, Daniel, and thank you for trusting me." For the first time, Daniel felt a weight lift from his chest. The scars of his loss would never fully heal, but in the Coopers, he had found a family that helped him carry the burden. And in himself, he began to find the strength to rebuild. The small wooden heart rested in Alan's hands, its rough edges and imperfect curves a testament to Daniel's resilience. Alan studied it for a moment, his expression soft, then placed it gently on the mantel above the fireplace. "This is going to stay right here," he said, his voice warm. "It'll remind us all how far we've come." Daniel blinked, surprised. "But it's not finished." Ellen smiled. "Neither are we." Ellen stepped into the room, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. She handed one to Daniel and sat beside him on the couch. "You know," she began, her voice light but thoughtful, "when I was younger, I used to think scars were ugly, something to be ashamed of. But then my grandmother told me that scars are just proof you survived." Daniel turned the mug in his hands, the warmth seeping through his fingers. "It doesn't feel like I've survived," he admitted quietly. "It just feels broken." Ellen placed a hand over his. "Broken isn't the end, sweetheart. Broken things can still be beautiful. And sometimes they're even stronger when they're put back together." The next morning, Daniel woke with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in months. The visit to the prison had stirred something deep within him. Not closure, not forgiveness, but perhaps a seed of understanding. Sullivan's apology hadn't erased the pain, but it had made the weight of his grief feel just a little less isolating. As he sat at his desk, staring at the small clay tree he'd made during art therapy, he decided it was time to face another shadow. The memories he had kept locked away since the accident. Alan and Ellen found him in the living room later that day, carefully unpacking a small box he'd brought from his old home. Inside were remnants of his life before, a few photographs, a worn baseball glove, a crumpled map of Yellowstone National Park, marked with his father's handwriting. They sat with him quietly, letting him take the lead as he sorted through the items. "This was from our last trip," Daniel said, holding up a picture of his parents standing on a beach, their arms wrapped around each other. His voice wavered, but he didn't stop. "We were supposed to go to Yellowstone next. Dad said we'd hike to see Old Faithful." Ellen leaned over, her gaze gentle. "You'll go there someday," she said. "And when you do, you'll carry them with you." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. "I think they'd like that." Over the next few weeks, Daniel began to open up more, both to the Coopers and to himself. At school, he found himself gravitating toward Emily, the girl who had shared the drawing with him. One afternoon, she approached him during lunch, holding a sheet of paper folded into an airplane. "This one's better," she said, her grin playful. "Try it." Daniel took the paper, smiling for what felt like the first time in weeks. He threw the airplane, and it soared across the cafeteria, earning a round of applause from nearby students. For the first time, Daniel felt like he belonged. One snowy afternoon, Alan suggested another hike. "There's a trail nearby that's amazing in the winter," he said, holding up a thermos of hot chocolate. "We'll bundle up and make it an adventure." Daniel hesitated, but the memory of their first hike, the calm it had brought him, convinced him to agree. The trail was blanketed in snow, the branches of trees heavy with frost. The air was crisp and sharp, filling Daniel's lungs with every breath. As they climbed, the stillness of the forest felt almost sacred. When they reached the summit, Daniel stood at the edge of the clearing, staring out at the white-draped hills that stretched endlessly before him. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Alan stepped beside him, his hands in his pockets. "It is. And so are the moments we make it to the top, even when the climb feels impossible." Daniel nodded, the weight in his chest lifting just a little more. He pulled the crumpled map of Yellowstone from his pocket and smoothed it out, holding it up to the wind. "I think they'd want me to see places like this," he said. "I think they'd want me to keep going." Alan placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice steady. "I think you're right." As the days turned into weeks, Daniel found himself slowly rebuilding. He began spending more time at the community center, joining Sophie's art therapy group regularly. He even started helping other kids with their projects, sharing the quiet joy he found in carving and molding. One evening, Sophie handed him a fresh block of clay and said, "Why don't you make something for yourself this time? Something that represents where you're going." Daniel thought for a long moment before beginning. His hands worked methodically, shaping and smoothing until the clay began to take form. By the time he finished, he had created a small mountain, its peak sharp and proud. When Sophie saw it, she smiled. A mountain. Strong. Unshakable. "I think that suits you." Daniel smiled back, a quiet pride warming him. "It's not perfect," he said, echoing Alan's earlier words. "But neither am I." Sophie nodded. "And that's exactly why it's beautiful." The Cooper's house became filled with Daniel's creations, wooden birds perched on shelves, clay trees on the mantel, and paper airplanes hanging from his bedroom ceiling. Each piece was a marker of his journey, a journey of grief, growth, and resilience. One night, as the family sat by the fire, Daniel looked at Alan and Ellen, his heart full in a way it hadn't been in a long time. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, "for everything." Ellen reached over, squeezing his hand. "We're the lucky ones, Daniel. You've brought so much into our lives." Alan raised his mug of tea, a grin spreading across his face. "To family," he said. "To family," Daniel echoed, a small but genuine smile lighting up his face. For the first time, he felt the word settle in his heart, no longer a distant memory, but a living, breathing reality. And in that moment, as the fire crackled softly and the winter wind howled outside, Daniel realized he wasn't just surviving. He was beginning to truly live, finding strength and moving forward. Winter melted into spring, and with it came subtle transformations in Daniel's life. The world outside seemed brighter, the snow giving way to fresh green shoots and blooming flowers. For Daniel, the changes were more than seasonal. He had started to see himself not just as someone surviving loss, but as someone who could shape his future, step by step. The first sign of his growing confidence came when he volunteered to speak at his school's spring assembly. The theme was overcoming challenges, and when the teacher had asked if anyone wanted to share a story, Daniel had hesitated for only a moment before raising his hand. Now, standing backstage, he clutched the note cards he had written the night before, his palms damp with nervous sweat. Ellen and Alan sat in the audience, their supportive smiles steadying him as he peeked out from behind the curtain. "You've got this," he whispered to himself, a mantra he'd heard Alan repeat to him countless times. When his name was called, he stepped onto the stage, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. He started slowly, his voice soft but growing stronger with each word. "Hi, I'm Daniel," he began, his gaze scanning the sea of faces. "A few months ago, I thought my life was over. I lost my parents in an accident, and it felt like everything good in my world was gone." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Daniel continued, drawing strength from the quiet attention of his peers. "I thought I'd never feel safe or happy again. But then, something changed. I met people who showed me that even when everything feels broken, you can start to rebuild." He paused, holding up a small wooden carving of a bird he had brought with him. "I made this when I felt lost. Carving it helped me realize that I could take something rough and shape it into something beautiful. It's not perfect, but it's mine. Just like my life isn't perfect, but it's mine to shape." The applause that followed was thunderous, but what meant more to Daniel was the flood of relief and pride he felt in his chest. For the first time, he had shared his story not as a victim, but as someone reclaiming his voice. That evening, the Coopers celebrated with pizza and ice cream. Alan raised a slice of pepperoni high, grinning. "To Daniel, the bravest kid I know." Daniel laughed, the sound warm and unguarded. "Thanks, but I think you're just saying that because I finally agreed to share the last slice." Ellen chuckled. "Don't get used to it. He's still pretty protective of his pizza." As they laughed and joked, Daniel felt something he hadn't in a long time. Normalcy. It wasn't that the pain of losing his parents was gone. It never would be. But he was learning how to carry it, how to make space for joy alongside the grief. The next day, Sophie called with exciting news. "Daniel, the community center is hosting an art showcase next month, and I think your work deserves to be part of it." Daniel blinked, stunned. "My work? You really think it's good enough?" "Absolutely," Sophie said firmly. "Your carvings and sculptures tell a story. They're powerful, just like you." After much coaxing, Daniel agreed. Over the next few weeks, he poured himself into creating new pieces: a carved tree symbolizing strength, a clay phoenix rising from ashes, and a small wooden heart with intricate detailing. Each creation felt like a step forward, a way of saying, "This is who I am now." On the night of the showcase, the community center buzzed with energy. People milled about, admiring the artwork on display. Daniel stood nervously beside his table, the small collection of pieces arranged carefully with handwritten notes explaining their significance. Ellen and Alan arrived early, their pride evident in the way they beamed at him. "Look at this," Alan said, pointing to the phoenix. "That's incredible, Daniel. It's like you're telling your story without even saying a word." As the evening went on, strangers stopped to admire his work, asking him questions about his process and inspiration. At first, Daniel stumbled over his words, unsure how to explain the deeply personal meaning behind each piece. But as the night progressed, he found himself speaking with more confidence, his voice steady and clear. Near the end of the event, Sophie approached him with a young girl in tow. "Daniel, this is Mia," she said. "She's just joined the art therapy program, and she was really inspired by your story." Mia, no older than 8, clutched a small clay figurine in her hands. "I made this," she said shyly, holding it out for Daniel to see. It was a lopsided star, its edges uneven but charming. "It's amazing," Daniel said sincerely. "You're really talented." Mia's face lit up, and for a moment, Daniel saw himself in her, hesitant, uncertain, but yearning for connection. He knelt to her level. "Keep making things, okay? It helps." That night, as Daniel packed up his pieces, Alan rested a hand on his shoulder. "You made a difference tonight," he said, "not just with your art, but with who you are." Daniel smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "Thanks. I think my parents would have liked this." "They'd be so proud of you," Ellen said, her voice thick with emotion. "Just like we are." The months that followed were filled with more steps forward. Daniel began to let people into his world, forming friendships at school and even joining the art club. He and Emily often worked on projects together, their quiet companionship a source of comfort and encouragement. One sunny weekend, the Coopers surprised Daniel with a road trip. As they pulled into a parking lot surrounded by towering evergreens, Daniel's breath caught in his throat. "Is this?" he asked, his voice breaking. Alan grinned. "Yellowstone. You've been talking about it since the first day you came to live with us. We thought it was time." Daniel stepped out of the car, the cool mountain air filling his lungs. As they hiked to Old Faithful, he felt his parents' presence with every step, their love woven into the fabric of his memories. When the geyser erupted, its spray reaching high into the sky, Daniel closed his eyes and whispered, "I'm here, Mom. I'm here, Dad." That night, as they sat around a campfire, Daniel looked at Alan and Ellen, his heart full. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, "for everything, for giving me a home, for helping me live again." Ellen wrapped an arm around his shoulders, her eyes shimmering with tears. "Your family, Daniel, and family never gives up on each other." Alan raised a mug of cocoa, his grin warm and proud. "To family," he said once more. This time, Daniel didn't hesitate. "To family," he echoed, his voice filled with hope, strength, and a quiet certainty that he was finally, truly home.